Welcome to another edition of You and Me and Multiple Sclerosis. My name is Pam, and I have been dealing with multiple sclerosis as a part of my life for almost 37 years. I'm not a doctor or a medical professional of any kind, but I do know an awful lot about what it's like to live every day with multiple sclerosis, and I wanted to share some of the things that I've discovered. I am going to do something I will probably do from time to time, and that is to review or look at some books or publications that I have found interesting on the subject of chronic illness, and maybe specifically multiple sclerosis sometimes, and maybe more general. And today we're going to look at not just one book, but actually two, because they've got a very similar theme, and I think you'll find it quite intriguing, whether you agree with it or not, or whether it resonates with you or not. But before we get started on the actual books, I wanted to look first at something that they both refer to and that they both are more or less based on, and that is something called Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACEs. By 1990, the first use, I think, of the term adverse childhood experiences was promoted, along with a checklist of these different characteristics. And I will not list those for you here, but I will provide you with a website where you can go look at them. But as it says here, ACEs are potentially traumatic events that occur in childhood. ACEs can include violence, abuse, and growing up in a family with mental health or substance use problems. Toxic stress from ACEs can change brain development and affect how the body responds to stress. ACEs are linked to chronic health problems, mental illness, and substance misuse in adulthood. People are understanding now that things that happen to us in childhood are particularly formative because our brains are not done growing yet. They're not formed entirely. So when a thing happens to us in childhood and it's traumatic, in some ways that's worse than if a trauma happens to you once you're an adult. Now, obviously, trauma is trauma, but as a child, you do not yet have the mental equipment. Your brain is only partially formed. So you don't have that whole frontal cortex developed, nor do you have the mature perspective that you would gain over a lifetime of seeing various things happen, reading about them, hearing that other people have had them happen, and to be able perhaps to put them into a context. When something happens when you're a child, you try your best to make sense of it, but it often makes no sense at all, and it's just something that's very hard to struggle along with. Well, looking at some statistics, again from the Centers for Disease Control website, I'll link this down below, 61% of adults had at least one ACE, and 16% had 4 or more types of ACEs. And as it said earlier, these relate to things like people that you are around all the time. So people in your household. Are they mentally ill? Do they have a substance abuse problem? Are they violent? Are they emotionally distant? Are they neglectful? Things that a child would deal with on a daily basis. So that's the statistics that they were able to collect. And when you look at something like that, you realize that not everybody's going to be completely honest, or maybe even you don't even recognize that it's something that's unusual or abnormal. The second bullet says that females in several racial or ethnic minority groups were at greater risk for experiencing 4 or more ACEs. And I clued in on that one partly because females are way more likely than males to get multiple sclerosis. And then finally, many people do not realize that exposure to ACEs is associated with increased risk for health problems across the lifespan. We now know a lot about the mind-body connection. For a lot of people, that still sounds like kind of a new agey concept, but our minds and our bodies are very linked. Heartbreak is a good example. You do actually feel physical pain, maybe in your chest, maybe in your stomach. You do feel emotions in your body. So why would it not be reasonable that feeling emotions over time can change your body? And one of the things that I have read in the books that we're going to discuss today is that as a child, if you are repeatedly exposed to trauma, it actually changes the way your brain is wired. That you become essentially physically different because of your brain wiring. Okay, now this chart is pretty helpful, again from that same CDC website. Adverse childhood experiences can lead to the following things, and it's got several categories here: health conditions, health risk behaviors, and socioeconomic challenges. And I will link this again below, but I'm really kind of focusing on health conditions for today, because if you look across the span here, you've got things like depressive disorder and asthma, kidney disease, cancer, diabetes. Well, multiple sclerosis is just as likely to be a result of these chronic childhood traumas. Well, here's the first book that I wanted to talk a little bit about today. It's got the intriguing title, The Body Keeps the Score, and it's by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, who, as you see here, is a psychiatrist, author, researcher, and educator based in Boston. And since the 1970s, his research has been in the subject of post-traumatic stress. So he's looked at post-traumatic stress in adults, because as you might remember, the term first became popularized in conjunction with soldiers returning from war and the traumas that they had experienced and the lingering effect that that had on them. In World War I, that was first noted, and it was referred to as shell shock. Nowadays we call it post-traumatic stress. But in a more recent time, we've realized post-traumatic stress relates to far more than just soldiers returning from the war. We're talking about chronic trauma that people are exposed to in their childhood. And as Dr. van der Kolk says, the effects of trauma live on not only in the emotional mind and the chemical makeup and circuitry of the brain, but also in the body's physiology. Traumatic experiences rewire the brain to cause people to be hypervigilant to threats. And also, survivors often cope by suppressing both their emotions and their physical sensations. And that was something that got me thinking, and I am not an emotional person in many ways. I could probably count on the fingers of one hand how many times I've cried in the past 20 years. But I also wonder if there isn't something to this idea that childhood trauma plays a role in how in touch you are with your emotions and your physical sensations. Okay, well now I'm giving it kind of short shrift here, but in his book, Dr. van der Kolk explores options for healing trauma because he thinks, okay, the body and the mind are so connected. He believes that we can use the body to release the trauma that the body has held in all this time. The body has essentially been keeping score, right? Every time something happens to you, it registers in your body. And so in order to release that, you have to release it through your body. And so as he says here, the bottom-up approach to treatment uses physical experiences that connect the body and the mind. This empowers patients to inhabit their bodies, to be present, and to learn how they can affect their emotions, all of which help them to counteract feelings of helplessness, rage, and emotional collapse. He has a number of YouTube videos. He talks about yoga and other physical exercises that will help you release the trauma that is essentially bound up in your body. And the other book that I want to look at, also a very intriguing title, When the Body Says No, by Hungarian-Canadian physician Gabor Maté. I first learned about this book through my MS support group, and I read it and I found it really pretty fascinating. He has a background in family practice and a special interest in childhood development, trauma, their potential and lifelong impacts on physical and mental health, including on autoimmune disease, cancer, attention deficit, hyperactivity disorder, addictions, and a wide range of other conditions. So as you can see there, when he talks about autoimmune disease, he is certainly talking about MS. In Chapter 2, The Little Girl Too Good to Be True, here's some of the things that he has to say. And by the way, the numbers in parentheses are the page numbers of the edition that I looked at, and the reference will be down below, as will the one for Dr. Van de Kolk's book. But he says on page 14 that patients burdened by extreme stresses were almost 4 times as likely to suffer exacerbations. And you are very familiar with that word exacerbation, right? And you shouldn't be too surprised to know that Chapter 2 actually is focused on multiple sclerosis. He also says that emotional stress may be implicated in the genesis of MS, not just the exacerbation. And here are possible factors in what he calls the natural development of MS, right? That this is not some freak thing, but that this occurs naturally because of the following things. Excessive emotional involvement with a parent. So you've heard of codependency. I'm thinking that's kind of what we're talking about here. And secondly, a lack of psychological independence. An overwhelming need for love and affection. And finally, an ability to feel or express anger. And we'll talk all about each of these things a little bit later on as we go. But one thing that he talks about on page 20 I found very interesting. In lab studies, autoimmune disease was initiated in rats who are blocked from following through on their flight or fight responses. And this creates an environmentally conditioned helplessness. So think of the child. The child does not have a lot of autonomy, right? They can't do what they want to do. They're kind of under the thumb of the parent, under parental control. And if they're being abused in any way, whether it's physical, sexual, mental, emotional, what have you, they can't do anything to change that situation. And normally, if you're confronted with something that's not good, not pleasant, frightening, whatever, you have choices. You can fight or you can flee, but unfortunately for children, a lot of the time they cannot do anything about it, and so they end up with this conditioned helplessness. And we often refer to that as the freeze response, right? When you can't fight and you can't flee, you freeze. And I think that happens sometimes with children who are experiencing trauma. Okay, now let's look briefly at Chapter 19. This is the 7 A's of healing. And if you're going to identify a problem, you need to say, how do I fix it? Or how do I at least work towards fixing it? And he mentioned 7 different things starting with A. He talks about acceptance as not just saying, okay, I'm going to resign myself to this, but he says the willingness to recognize and accept how things are without, and this is the important part, without allowing it to define our approach to the future. So in other words, don't be in denial about it. He actually would probably go as far as to say that one reason that trauma continues to damage us into our adult lives is our denial. That we ever had trauma in the first place, that we ever were a victim of something that was bigger than we could fix. We never can come to an acceptance of the way things were and how they influenced how we are now. It doesn't necessarily mean that this is what we're stuck with, is what he's saying. The second one is awareness. Symptoms are not just problems to be solved, according to Dr. Maté, but messages to be heeded. So in other words, okay, I'm going to get this MS symptom, and I'm going to say to myself, oh no, I need to go to the doctor and get a pill for this, or a shot for this, or whatever. I've got to fix it. Well, it's not just that. He's not saying don't go and get it fixed, but recognize that your body is telling you something, and that you need to heed that, and not just try and cover it up and go on. The third thing he talks about, anger. The repression of anger is a major risk factor because it increases physiological stress. And you know that, right? When you're angry, your heart races, sometimes you break out in sweat, your face flushes, your muscles tense, and that is very stressful on your body. The anxiety of anger and other negative emotions like sadness and rejection may become deeply bound in the body. If you're not able to express anger in a healthy way, and he does talk about that there is healthy anger for sure. In fact, anger can be very therapeutic. It can help clear the air. It can help strengthen relationships. The way we often express anger is beyond letting someone know that you are displeased, but in other words, you're expressing rage, and rage never results in anything constructive. Rage is destructive. Another thing that he talks about is autonomy. And we talked a little about this already, right? Children don't have very much autonomy. The development of an internal center of control. And the greater the exposure to dysfunction in childhood, he says, the worse the health status of the adult. Boundaries are routinely violated or not even set up in the first place. So even as a child, you should be allowed to have boundaries. Your parents should allow you to choose. But a parent that just goes through your stuff, gets rid of your things, doesn't even ask your permission. Well, permission sounds like an interesting word for a kid, right? But think about that. Why not ask the child to be involved? You're helping develop a more healthy self-image, a sense of control at a young age. And yeah, maybe you don't even set those up in the first place. There's no boundaries right from the get-go. The child never believes they have any agency, any control over anything, and that can be pretty stressful. He quotes Dr. Joanne Peterson, "We experience life through our bodies, and if we are not able to articulate our life experience, our bodies speak what our minds and mouths cannot." So in other words, the body says no when maybe your conscious mind doesn't even have the courage or the awareness to say no. Attachment is our connection with the world, and people without social connection are at greater risk for illness. I think we all know that. We think of people living alone, especially when they get older and they're more isolated because maybe they've got physical limitations. Well, they're at greater risk for illness because they don't have anyone that they feel cares about them, and they don't have anyone to care about. Assertion is another thing that he talks about. It's the statement of our being, a positive valuation of ourselves, independent of our history, personality, abilities, or the world's perception of us. So in other words, not being so dependent on what other people think about us. We have our self-esteem regardless of what the world thinks. Now, of course, that could be unhealthy too if you go too far that way, right? If everyone thinks that you're a certain thing and you just refuse to accept it, it might be because you're just being bullheaded. But if you grow up in a home where your parents are constantly telling you you have no value, you're an irritant, they wish they never had you, they take every opportunity they can to belittle you or put you down, then it's awfully hard to develop that positive valuation of yourself. And then finally, affirmation is the movement towards something of value, and that is kind of the culmination of all these other things. If we believe that we are worthy, the next step, of course, would be we want to move towards something of value. Young people want to change the world, right? We want to do something with our lives that has a purpose and has a meaning. We want to love somebody. We want to have children and raise them up to be good people, good citizens. Those are valuable things. Again, if you have had a lot of trauma in your life, you might have difficulty with this particular part of being healthy and whole. Well, that's kind of a quick rundown, an overly quick rundown, I admit, on those 2 books and on adverse childhood experiences in general. There's so much more that can be said, and I really do encourage you to search out those 2 books and read them, because there's a lot in there that's pretty thought-provoking. And maybe you think that, this can't apply to me because I had a very healthy childhood and my parents are great and we've always been close. And I am not going to tell you that you just must have some suppressed memory of trauma or something. No, I'm not saying that. Because just as not every case of MS stems from the same thing or exhibits itself in the same way, not everyone who goes through trauma develops MS, and not every case of MS is rooted in trauma. Nonetheless, I think this is something worth looking at, and perhaps when you watched it, you found this helpful and you'd not thought about it before. If it's something that really resonates with you and you're realizing, yeah, there's some stuff in my past I just have not been dealing with in a healthy way, I would encourage you to seek out professionals that can help you with that can give you some ways to work through some of that and release some of the trauma that's been trapped in your body all this time. The body does keep the score. The body does record things that happen to us, and it keeps that memory long after our conscious minds have forgotten all about it. So it is something to be aware of. Your body and your mind are not 2 separate entities. They are interlinked, interwoven. It would be really good, I think, for your health, physical, emotional, mental, spiritual, all around, if you look into this subject a little bit and give it some thought. And I hope to see you again in my next video.